Hello, everyone, friends, enemies, frenemies, aliens. Welcome back. We are going to geek out on another book today, a continuation of sorts. I had done a video a while back doing a review of A Dark Glory War, which is quite an oldie, but a lovely adventure tale. Quite military, high-ish fantasy with a nice flow, nice pacing to it, and some interesting characters. It had its flaws, of course. There was a lot of kind of focusing a little bit too much on heroism and what it is to be a hero, and so things came off a little bit cringy sometimes, and characters were a little bit one-sided. There wasn't much development really of anyone outside of the main character, Taron Hawkins. But it was still a pleasant read. It's a fun read, and it's worthwhile extending that interest into the trilogy which follows, which is, of course, set in the same world, and it begins with Fortress Draconis. And I have to say, this trilogy, especially starting with Fortress Draconis, is a definite improvement over A Dark Glory War. 25 years have passed since the ending of A Dark Glory War, and so we are seeing a relatively new main character by the name of Will, and Will, of course, is taking up the mantle that Taron Hawkins had in Dark Glory War, where they are fighting against this Empress Chitrin, who is this half dragon, half Urzrethi, who is basically Urzrethi would be the equivalent of this story's dwarves in a certain sense, although they can merge and shape and shift their form and body. So they can have an arm that becomes a pickaxe or a sword. Their body can become more armor-like, so to speak. So this woman is a child of both of these, and she's, as far as our heroes are concerned, she is trying to just take over the south. So her people live in the north, and it's predominantly not humans. It's predominantly made up of what we would probably consider monsters, but there are things like Horgons and Vylians and Temerises. So these are giant bird-like creatures, and little, I would say, best equivalent would be a little savage squirrel-like human people. So it's a little bit difficult to describe, Valians and the others. And of course, there's a host of other creatures that she creates and merges together that you see expanded upon within the entire trilogy. And it's pretty interesting being able to see all these different kinds of enemies, especially when you consider the Sulansiri. The Sulansiri are basically people and sometimes creatures that Chitrin has made her own. They become more than human. Sometimes they're dead and they've been brought back to life to serve. Sometimes they are humans or creatures who have decided to give into her power, and so she remakes them, gives them abilities, strength, and many times they cannot be killed except by a magical weapon. So these are her generals, the leaders of her armies. And the main cast, or most of the main cast of the first book, A Dark Glory War, has actually been made into Sulansiri. They are the enemies, the main protagonists of the story, along with Chitrin. And so that adds an extra layer of, I don't want to call it too much complexity, really, because those characters weren't that developed in the first book either. It's one of the biggest issues, even with Fortress Draconis. There's just not that development, that much development happening within the characters. Will, our main character, who is a thief who gets caught up in this prophecy saying that a Norrington will lead the way to the defeat of Chitrin, gets caught up in this because he is found out to be the son of a former character from A Dark Glory War, and he's supposed to lead the charge. So he gets taken up by Resolute, who is a dark elf who we met, well, this series equivalent of a dark elf, really, the Vork Elves. And he is from the first book, and someone we know as Kedden's Crow at this point, but which is very clearly obvious to us, is Taron Hawkins from the first novel, the last of the survivors of the group of heroes, and mostly our main protagonist from A Dark Glory War. And so we follow these three mainly throughout a Fortress Draconis. We are introduced to some other characters like Alexia, who is a young general who has basically been raised for the last 25 years to take on Chitrin and lead the armies. She's the daughter of someone we see in the first book, for a small period of time, known as King Kirill. He passed away. And she probably gets the most airtime, so to speak, comparatively to Will. We do get a little bit of perspective from Kedden's Crow in this book, but it's really mainly Will and Alexia. So it's not that big of a cast, but there's a lot of characters who get introduced, added in, and kind of just flung in there. Resolute, I find, is the biggest issue in Fortress Draconis. He was the biggest issue in A Dark Glory War, and he continues to be a really large issue throughout the other two books in this trilogy because he's never ever given a point of view. You see him, he talks, but you never really get to know him, even though he's always part of the story, which is a very unfortunate thing. I mean, sometimes time is wasted on points of views of characters who we don't need to get to know their point of view. It's fine for them to be side characters, whereas Resolute would have been a fascinating character development. And unfortunately, Michael Stackpole just doesn't choose to develop him much at all, except as a sideline character, even though he's so important, really, to the story in so many ways. He's such a driving force, and he's like that basically from A Dark Glory War all the way to the end of this trilogy. So that's a little bit unfortunate. These books, especially Fortress Draconis, definitely thrive off of military know-how. Michael really loves to explain battles, what's happening, what leaders are thinking, and so that's pretty interesting, especially if you're into that kind of stuff. I'm not a huge fan of that, but it's done well enough and isn't confusing in any way, so you don't want to shoot your brain off. It's not like it's just tons and tons of military information, so that's pretty fun. And of course, there's just in the same way that Chitrin and her forces have a lot of complexity because there's so many different kinds of creatures that you're being introduced to. At the same time, there's so many different peoples of different nations, different kinds of elves, the Ursurethi, that you kind of get this nice little mishmash of peoples. The world seems really large, it seems expansive, it seems very culturally different. Even though you don't spend that much time exploring all the different cultures, you still get this nice little feeling of expansiveness, that it's not really just a limited small story. You understand the scope, that there is like this war happening and everyone's kind of going at each other. So that's really interesting. Politically, there's some cool stuff happening. It's pretty fun. I'm not a huge fan of politics inside of fantasy stories, but I get it, especially when you're kind of doing a bigger series that's kind of focused on war. You're going to have politics. And Michael does a pretty good job of showcasing how leaders suck most of the time and just poke their noses, and they're always trying to like one up each other, even when everyone's at risk. And so that's done pretty darn well. Magic system inside is very complex. I wouldn't consider it a super hard magic system because I mean, things are explained, but even in their explanation, they're extremely detailed, but it's not like you really get it. So it's a hard magic system that you don't really fully understand even when it's explained. Not like, for example, something like, Mistborn, which is, I would consider a relatively hard magic system, but it makes sense. You kind of get it. There is some soft magic as well inside, but that's more later on in the series. In Fortress Draconis, it's not too complex. There is another character who you do get a point of view who becomes quite important, but his importance is kind of strange, especially within Fortress Draconis. His name is Kerrigan, and he's sort of our mage character. And he is the one showcasing all the different complexities of magic and what there is to it, and how magic has been sort of tampered down and held back because of people like Chitrin and her predecessor Kirun, who we learn again about in Dark Glory War. And so Kerrigan's kind of fascinating. We don't spend too much time with him. We spend a lot more time with Will and Alexia, but Kerrigan is still pretty fun, and he becomes sort of interesting a little bit later, but not really in the first book. I wouldn't go too far on that. So from a character development perspective, we're not getting super much in this book. We get a little taste of like what's happened to Taron Hawkins, obviously from the first book, and how he's developed over the last 25 years, and we see that he's still suffering a lot because of the consequences in the end of that book, so that was really nice. Will, Kerrigan, Alexia, they're interesting people. Well written, but I mean, still kind of one-dimensional in this. I mean, Will is a little bit interesting, obviously, because he comes from a thief background, and suddenly he's thrust into like being surrounded by nobility and having to be a hero and lead people. And so seeing his development is quite fun. But overall, still, Michael's not the best at character development, at least within this series. Again, world perspective, world building, I think it's pretty awesome. I think it's really cool, the world he made. There's a lot of depth to it. It's vibrant, it's dark, it's gritty, and the way he portrays the political system and all the ins and outs and back and forth that's going on behind the scenes is really pretty well done. So from a purely military-ish perspective on war and whatnot, this is a fun read. I'd give it a 7 on 10. 7 on 10. Leaning towards an 8, but it really falters in terms of the character development, especially within this first book, at least for me. 7 on 10. I would still recommend. Check it out. It's an enjoyable read if you want something you can just blow through to pass the time. And of course, see a lot of death and destruction using powers. It's always fun, right? I think so. Let me know what you think down below. Check out A Dark Glory War. Check out the review I did of it. If you have not read that one first, definitely read it before starting Fortress Draconis. I mean, you don't necessarily have to have read it, but it's better. It'll be definitely a lot less emotionally fulfilling if you do not read A Dark Glory War first. I'll post a link down below of my review, and you can decide on your own. Like, comment, subscribe. Check out the website at geektales.ca. Thanks for listening.